Before we actually go over to the hatchery and we see a practical demonstration of what we do, I want to talk about some of the challenges that we have in terms of grading and counting in particular. And I think many of the nursery operators are familiar with the challenges that come with it. Why are we going to do it? I think it's pretty obvious. First of all, the hatcheries and the nurseries need to be comfortable with the numbers that they're getting, and I think that'll come with time. You know, once you've got the capacity to count, you'll count a few batches and you'll monitor what's going on, and you'll become comfortable with what's coming down from the hatchery. And it's interesting to look at what happens with Pacific oyster growers. They seem to have reached that point. So I think ultimately things will relax a little bit, but it's really important to know how to do this for a variety of other reasons. You need to be able to, beyond the cost issues, you need to be able to assess what sort of performance you're getting in your nursery. It's a basic part of your business. You need to know how many numbers you're getting out, and you can't do that unless you know what you've got in the first place. So if you're trying to do what Jeff is doing and say, okay, I've got orders for 1 million, how many do I actually need to fill that order? I need 1.2 million, I need 1.5 million. I can look back at the sort of performance I've had in the past and then come up with something that's going to make some sense. Things like stocking density are tremendously important in terms of the performance of your nursery. Your nurseries are all different. The amount of stock that you can carry all differ, and the amount of stock that you can have in one screen differs. And it's quite useful for you to know what you can carry at one particular time. So it's useful to be able to grade a particular screen, look at the rate at which they're growing and say, okay, I've got too many or they're not growing fast enough. I need to have less next time around, so you can start to micromanage the nursery as well. You want to know the duration that you've actually got this stuff in there. How long is it hanging on? Some of you are getting some batches, like you'll get the first batch from Nick Dost, it'll come through, you put that in your system, you'll start grading it, and some of that will go out, and then you'll get the next batch in, and that'll get blended in with the batch before, and you don't really start to get any idea of what's happening in terms of the performance across the nursery. You've got one long perpetual batch, and you need to know those sorts of things. You need to be able to tell how much you're discarding. What will happen with a lot of these runs, particularly for people like Jeff, is he'll order 1.5 million because he knows he wants to get 1 million out to his farmers, and he'll produce 1 million or 1.2 million, and he'll have the end of the batch that he wants to get rid of. And so that you want to be able to take those away progressively. You've got that last little bit that's hanging on that last 500 screen. How many are there? Can I afford to throw those away? You know, they're wasting space in my nursery. I don't need them. Can I just count them up and say, okay, there's only 50,000 there. I can get rid of those. They're not going to affect my final total. I can still reach my targets. And also seasonal changes. We've been talking about this overwintering and so on. You are going to get seasonal changes in the rate at which your spat grow. You want to be able to monitor that and determine how long you're going to have a batch of spat. If you get your spat now from Nick, are you going to get them out of the nursery in time before the water temperatures fall down, they stop their growth, and they just have to sit in the nursery through winter? By monitoring seasonal changes through counts and volumes, you can then get a reasonable idea on how quickly you can turn them out of your nursery and how that's changing over the season, what you can do, what you can't do. So it's pretty important to be able to do these sorts of things well and truly beyond the fact that you want to be comfortable that Nick's given you what you ordered. When to count? Ex-hatchery as soon as possible. These things are actually surprisingly robust, and when they come down, you can grade them and you can count them. One of the big things about the counts is that you're not counting them all. You want to very gently grade your stock so that you get it into your size grades, put them straight into your nurseries. And the additional stress of counting will only be that very small sample that you actually take out and count. So you don't have to do this to all of the batches, and you can take them. You can probably leave it a day or two as long as you reassess your volumes. But you've got to be very careful. The longer you leave it from the hatchery, the less and less an accurate determination of what you're going to get, a less accurate determination of what you've actually got from Nick. So I would like you to see you do it within 24 hours to 48 hours. So sure, bring them in, pop them in water, sit them in water overnight, and then come back the next day and do your gradings and do your counts straight away. They are fine. We've had problems in the past, or we had one batch where we had problems post-transport. And so a lot of people lost animals very quickly, and suddenly everyone was very, very concerned about what's going on. We have to take a lot of care with these animals. They're very delicate. That was probably a function of the transport. We suspect they came down in unpressurised transport when they came through in the air. We think we had some real problems there rather than what actually happened in terms of grading and so on. So everyone got a little bit of a scare, which is often a good thing. By all means, be careful with them, but they will tolerate this. There's just no problems in doing it in the first day or so. So you can get onto it as quickly as you can.
Natural mortality is highest when the oysters are tiny, especially up to the 500 micron size. That's just 0.5 of a millimetre. So a small percent of your spat could die and disintegrate before you've had a chance to count them if you leave it too long. That means you'll never know what your actual mortality rate is, and you could miss a crucial health problem that needs to be fixed. Obviously, we can't count all the spat in a delivery, so we'll take some representative samples from our order and count those. Once we know how many spat there are on average per mill, we can estimate the total that we've received.
It'd be plus or minus to probably 0.5 mil.
The best way to get these accurate samples is to grade our delivery into the different sizes that make it up.
Now the first thing is grading, and I think everyone in the oyster industry is familiar with that. It's just basically sorting out the oysters into some sort of uniform class on a particular basis. And I think most of you are familiar with either trying to sort large oysters on the basis of size or weight. In terms of grading, particularly when they come out of the hatchery, screening is the most common, and that's going to do it on the basis of size. Weight is fantastic once they get to a reasonable size. So by the time you're getting stuff that's coming out of your nursery, larger stuff that might go on to farmers, that's fine. It does not work for small spat ex-hatchery. And the problem is they are so small, they have such large surface areas, they retain so much moisture on the outside, it really comes down to the numbers that you end up with come down to how heavy they are and how much water they're retaining. Because it's nigh on to impossible to get them equally dry every time, it becomes very difficult to do it by weight. So weight is fine once they get larger, but not for ex-hatchery and not for most of the situations that we're talking about in the nursery. The sorts of reasons that we use grading, first of all, grading can increase the accuracy of your counts. If you've got nice tight size grades, you've got little opportunity to accidentally pick a batch of larger spat or a batch of larger or smaller spat and bias your counts. What does happen in nurseries, what can happen when you're actually tapping them out or grading them, is that they will self-sort on the basis of size. So the light ones will often float to the top because you've got water coming up. So if you just went up to a nursery screen and you waved your little container through and you took your sample out, you can get a biased sample. So by grading, they're fairly uniform in size so that your chances of getting an accurate count are increased. What it does in terms of the nursery as well is it increases the overall performance of your nursery. I think most of you realise now that if you grade occasionally you get better performance out of your nursery. And what that really does is take some of the larger oysters that are competing very well for the food, moves them away from some of the smaller ones and gives the smaller ones a chance to actually express their normal growth rates. So it really can have some advantages. And there are also a lot of advantages in terms of your nursery efficiency. You want to get them out of the nursery as quickly as you can, so that if you grade and you grade relatively regularly, you can take those size grades that are large enough to go out to the field and get them out in the field where they belong, where it's cheaper, where you're not running pumps, where you're not maintaining them every day. Now, a couple of quick points about grading. Right through the nursery, we always use wet sieving. You can dry sieve, that is that you can actually take them out and just put them straight on a screen and dry sieve them once they're a reasonable size. But in terms of nurseries, for us, for general practice, it's always wet sieving. You'll see that this afternoon, so it's always done underwater. The other thing that's important, I think most of you have realised it now, is to realise that mesh size is not mesh size per se. When you have a 1 millimetre mesh, what they are referring to is this distance here, along there. What you have for a 1 millimetre mesh is a diagonal that is much, much larger. So if you have spat that are 1 millimetre in size, most of them will actually go through a 1 millimetre mesh. So really be aware of this in terms of what's going out, particularly because Mike's going to teach you or talk about how to use your microscopes to measure your spat so you can see how fast they're growing. Remember, a 1 millimetre spat will go straight through 1 millimetre mesh, and simply because of this. So it's an important concept to have in mind.
Under the microscope, we can see how much variation there is in a graded batch of spat. This is caused by the larger shells passing through the mesh diagonally, and it occurs in all size grades, not just at 1 millimetre.
One of the things I do want you to be aware of with grading, as Nick pointed out, is one, during transport, and that's a point here, they can rumble a little and you can lose some frill, so that I wouldn't be surprised to find volumes actually drop a little when they arrive. Yep, and then within a day or so I would expect them to go beyond what Nick... At that size they can put on, we're talking about stuff that's only half a millimetre in size or 500 microns. At that size they can grow 50 to 100 microns, put a 50 to 100 microns shell on in a day. So they can literally put on 20% of their size. They can move tremendously quickly. So these volumes can bounce around and you've got to be aware of that. If you can do the volumes and then you look at what Nick says and said, oh my God, they're different. I don't mind that at all, as long as you count them. Don't rely on the volumes. The volumes themselves are not enough to tell you what's going on. Couple them with the counts, do the counts as well. Another warning, I know we've got nursery operators here that have got different levels of experience, but just as a ground rule, if Nick sends you down stuff that's 1000 micron retained, always take it back to 500 micron screen. Never ever assume that 1 micron retained is going to stay on 1 micron. As I said, I think that's where a lot of the losses go. We do get this loss of frill. You can't perfectly grade all of the seeds, so there's always going to be some stuff that goes through. So as a precaution, always go a screen size smaller. It's really important. Always go backwards. Now, just a few quick notes. The tighter the grading, the better. More counts, greater accuracy, so the more you do it, the more likely you are to be accurate in terms of your counts, and that's particularly the case if you're not going to grade. Again, grade. Good equipment, greater accuracy. You can get the scientific equipment, it's not expensive. I think the last lot I bought was $6 each for the small ones, and the larger ones go up, so you might end up paying $20, $25 for a larger measuring cylinder. They're very robust, you'll have them forever, and they're easily obtainable. If you can't get them, get in touch with us and we'll tell you where to get them from. Test your equipment. I know I've seen people using mum's cookingware and all sorts of things to actually do measures. If you get one good volumetric cylinder, you can then use that to test the other bits and pieces you're using. You might have bought it at the hardware store, it might have a litre written on it. It's actually worth testing that and just sort of, and if you're really worried, we can help you out with that as well. And the other thing is use suitable equipment. This is actually something that, that had never occurred to us, but Tony brought to our attention, and that is if you're counting large spat, try to avoid doing it in a very small cylinder. You need to be able to pack those spat down tightly. So use a cylinder that's an appropriate size for the spat that you're actually trying to count. In the hatchery, you can get away with the small 10mm stuff and the sorts of things that will come out from Nick. The small 10mm cylinders that you'll see this afternoon are fine. If you're actually measuring the spat as they're going out to farmers, they're way too small. The spat just end up sitting on top of one another and there are too many voids and you don't get an accurate assessment of what's in a particular volume. And you probably need a range of them. And as spat get larger, don't automatically start to count less because you feel comfortable counting less. Make sure you always count a reasonable number. When they're small, you'll end up counting thousands. There's just no way to avoid it. When they're larger, you do need to do 3 or 4 lots of 100 at least and start to get an idea of what's going on.
Now we know the benefits of grading and counting. Let's run through the steps of doing it. Say we've just received a delivery from the hatchery and we want to check we've got what we ordered. We've asked for 250,000 spat retained on a 1mm screen. 1mm equals 1000 microns. Remember, the seed will have grown since our order was put together, and some spat may have lost frill through rumbling in transit. So the oysters themselves may now vary considerably in size from what the hatchery graded. That's why our order will no longer match the weight or volume on the delivery docket. Counting all the oysters individually would take forever, so we need a quick way to estimate our totals. In theory, we could take a small sample of the spat, say 3 mils of seed, and count them to work out how many spat there are per milliliter. If we measure the current volume of our delivery, we'll know roughly how many spat we've got in total. But the spat will have grown unevenly since leaving the hatchery, and if our 3 mils contain more of the larger oysters, then there'll appear to be fewer spat per mil overall than in reality. Conversely, if there's too many of the smaller spat in our sample, we'll think there are more spat per mil in our delivery than there really are. This sampling method only works well if the spat are a similar size or very evenly mixed. So for accuracy, it's best to separate our order into its component sizes and take our samples from each grade. In this case, our 1mm retained spat now range from 800 microns up to 1250 microns retained. First, we grade the spat as tightly as possible by passing it through a series of increasingly fine mesh screens.
Rightio, so again we're going through the same sort of process.
Then we measure the volume of each size graded. And here's some voluming in progress. It's really important to use accurate measuring containers for this.
And this is where the important part comes in, is tapping them down. I can stick them in there now, and they're, 36 mils I've got in there now, so by tapping it down.
Here, we're making sure the spat is evenly packed with no voids.
Okay, we're down to 22 mils now.
You can buy containers like these from scientific suppliers, or SOCO can help you source them, and they're not that expensive. Once we've volumed each grade, let's say we've got 85 mils of 0.8mm retained spat, 250 mils of 1mm retained spat, and 105 mils of 1.25mm retained spat. To work out the total number in our delivery, we'll take 3 samples of 3 to 5 mils from each size grade and count how many spat are in each sample. Again, once we know how many spat there are per milliliter, we can estimate the total number in the whole grade. The larger the spat, the larger our sample volumes need to be to get an accurate average.
Rightio, so we've initially just put some oysters into the measuring cylinder, and we want between sort of a 3 mil and a 5 mil sample, but we want to make sure that if it's either 3 mil, 4 mil, 5 mil, regardless of what it is, that it's exactly on that sort of 3 or 5 mil, and we want to make sure that it's compacted as best we possibly can. So now's where the fun begins. We know that we've got 3.5 mils here.
With small spat, there may be thousands in each sample, and with 3 samples to count, it can be time-consuming, so you'll want to use a mechanical counter.
So basically now we just get in there and we start counting. That's what our clickers are here for. So we start counting.
Most of your deliveries from the hatchery will be in this smaller size range, typically between 500 and 1000 microns retained. So this is the technique you'll most often use to check your delivery numbers. Remember, we need to take at least 3 samples from each grade, because even within grades there can be a lot of size variation.